Go over information processing theory and anatomy of learning. Information processing theory brings in the first 4 weeks of the semester into one theory. And I'm going to show you how they're connected in just a second. We covered social learning theory in week 2, multiple intelligence theory in week 3, types of knowledge and Bloom's taxonomy in week 4, and in week 5, last week, we covered teaching style, more specifically experiential learning and the other elements of teaching, the big 5. So in social learning theory, that's how we learn from other people. That's how we pay attention to information that we're getting from other people. In multiple intelligence theory, that's learning based on preference. So think of learning style. How do you like to receive information? Then with types of knowledge and Bloom's taxonomy, that's based on the course that you're in. So depending on the course, the type of course will tell you what to focus on first to become an efficient learner. And then how does teaching style, teaching method, how does that help us process information efficiently from the environment? So now let's look at information processing theory. This is the most common way that it's drawn out. Very linear. We know that learning doesn't necessarily happen exactly like this. What I mean by that is there are other elements that influence learning. This is a part of learning, but it's not the only process. So when we get to the second half of the semester and we look at Bandura's model of social learning, more specifically observational learning and modeling, and we get into the mediating process, you'll look at the influence of behavior, more specifically motivation on learning. But for right now, let's just look at information processing and the structure of it. And it'll help you understand why information is often organized in the way that it is. So we have environmental stimulus that comes in. Smell, touch, hearing, taste, sight. If you don't pay attention to it, it's just lost. It says forgotten. That really should say lost, but this is actually how they draw it. But if you don't even pay attention to it, it was never known, so it can't be forgotten. It just never made its way to short-term memory. I'm going to show you in the next slide how attention connects to what we just talked about in the first 4 weeks. Social learning, learning style, teaching method, types of knowledge, how those are ways of paying attention to new and novel information. Then you have short-term memory. It has a limited capacity, 7 plus or minus 2 items. So that could be as high as 9 down to 5. When I create rules or instructions, you'll notice on your handouts, typically there are no more than 3 instructions. And the reason I do that is because I know short-term memory has a limited capacity. I don't want you to have to keep referring back to the instructions, so I make those general, easy to remember. We can get to the specifics later on. We can have other instructions, but they all should connect to the big general instructions. Same thing applies to kids. If you're going to create rules for kids, if you're going to teach young children, don't create 10, 20 rules. Look at those rules and how can you get it down to ideally 3, but no more than 5. And for young kids, especially around kindergarten, in elementary school, you'll find that they're able to follow a general rule because they can remember it. And then you can link in the specifics. It's like conceptual learning. Learn the big picture items first, then you can get into the weeds. If you're creating rules, create the major rules, the foundational rules, and then over time, you can educate people into the more specific rules that tie into those. But they need the big picture items first. So you can hold information in short-term memory without rehearsal for about 20 seconds for the average person. If you don't rehearse it enough, it's lost. If you rehearse it enough, it can go into long-term memory, which is indefinite. As long as you don't have disease or damage to that area of the brain, it should be there. Now, it may be hard to retrieve sometimes, but eventually you'll retrieve the information. If you've ever had a word on the tip of your tongue, that you knew the word, you couldn't quite recall it, or some event, and then a week later it hit you, you just hadn't retrieved it in a while. That neural connection wasn't as strong as it normally is for recall to happen. But once you recalled it, it's probably easier for you to remember after that point. So that's part of encoding. We rehearse it, we get it over here encoded in long-term memory so we can retrieve it and recall it. Those steps I just mentioned, we're going to see this in Bandura's mediating process. So just remember that. I don't want to go into it yet. We're going to cover that in the second half of the semester. It's going to be the very first theory we cover in terms of observational learning and Bandura's mediating process. But information processing theory had a huge influence on Bandura. He just knew that there was something missing. Let's look at attention real quick and how the first part of the semester, those first 4 weeks, tie in to helping you pay attention to what's being presented to you, what's coming in from the environment. All right, if we look here, environmental stimulus comes in. As long as we pay attention, we can get past this sensory register. It's come in through the senses. We paid attention to it. Maybe that information came through from our group, so social learning. Maybe it came through because the teacher was putting the information into our learning style, meaning they had a lot of visuals and we were a visual learner. And then they paired that with auditory information. Maybe we were a kinesthetic learner and they had us act it out or perform some sort of action or activity. Maybe we were in a history class, and because we knew it was a history class, we focused on that explicit information, the declarative knowledge, the episodic information, events that were happening on the timeline. Maybe it was because of the teaching style. Maybe we like to learn from our experiences or from others, and experiential learning tied in. So it could be any teaching style. It doesn't have to be experiential learning. Those all helped us pay attention. As long as we've thought about how we learn, metacognition, we put some thought into how we try to take in the information and pay attention to it, that'll help us become more efficient learners. So those were the first 4 weeks, and they were connected to how do we pay attention to information so we can get it here, so we can rehearse it enough to get it over into long-term memory. Now let's look at a very complicated diagram I created, but I wanted to show you how this is conceptual learning and how it links the first half of the semester and everything we've talked about. I'll do this quick so we can get to anatomy of learning. I know this is convoluted, but it'll make sense. So we just covered information processing. It was here, right? Had environmental information come in. We paid attention to it either socially, through learning style, through types of knowledge, through teaching style, or all of those, or maybe some. And that helped us get it to short-term memory so that it wasn't forgotten. We rehearsed it so we could encode it over in here into long-term memory. But this time I've drawn out long-term memory instead of like a file cabinet, like Bloom's taxonomy on the cognitive domain, because that's really what we're talking about in Bloom's on the cognitive domain. That explicit knowledge here that we remembered, developed an understanding, that we applied, analyzed, and evaluated to create something of our own. It got us through the upper levels of learning, so we had an easy time storing this in long-term memory, so we could recall it, either explicit knowledge or implicit knowledge. Explicit was the types of knowledge. We just talked about that. Declarative knowledge, episodic for history. Semantic, conceptual knowledge is what we're doing right now, linking concepts. Conditional knowledge, when to use information. Now let's roll over to the implicit side. For the first half of the semester, I mentioned the behavioral side, but we haven't gotten to it yet. We've really been stuck on the procedural, the psychomotor, the skills, the actions, the steps to do something, the process. We've covered that in detail, especially with the activities. But the second half, we're going to spend a lot of time here. on the affective domain. How does behavior influence learning? How does motivation affect our behavior? How does motivation affect our performance when it comes to learning? So that's going to be all about the second half. So remember, I mentioned Bandura. He took information processing and he added an element from the affective domain, motivation, and its role on behavior, and its role and influence on learning. That will be the second half. Now, let's finish this up. Where's this going on in the brain? But let's talk about it in terms of learning style, so it'll be easy for you to retain and link back to week 3. So if we're reading and writing information, let's think VARK, visual, auditory, reading and writing, right? It's happening in the frontal lobe. Remember, I just talked about the affective domain, the implicit side, behavior, motivation, behavior, part of it is being processed here. Think of Phineas Gage. He had a rod shot through his head, super nice guy before, but that's how we found out the frontal lobe, part of it, was involved in behavior. All these folds that you see, when you think back to information processing, all those convoluted folds, that's long-term memory in the cerebral cortex, right? That's where they're being stored. All that types of knowledge that we talked about, cerebral cortex, long-term memory. The parietal lobe, that kinesthetic movement's happening right here in the blue. So movement. Occipital lobe, back here, visual processing, so for the visual learners. And then that auditory, happening right here in the temporal region. Now let's look at that again in terms of VARK. Reading and writing, kinesthetic, visual, auditory. But now let's talk about in terms of information processing. I told you the long-term memory was up here in cerebral cortex. But right here, inside, underneath those folds, is the hippocampus. Processing from short-term to long-term. So if you've watched the movie 50 First Dates and she had a problem retaining new information, she could remember everything that happened before the injury, but couldn't remember what happened after. Could process no new information. That happened in the hippocampus. That's how we discovered that area of the brain. People that had damage there had problems storing new memories. Fear response, amygdala, basal ganglia, emotion, reward. So when we get to reinforcement and the role of emotion, remember that affective domain that we talked about here? Emotion and feelings. Basal ganglia. Reinforcement, when we get to conditioning in the second half. And habits, conditioning, right? That's what we're talking about. Cerebral cortex, we're right here, psychomotor, skill-based, implicit, skill-based fine motor skills. Those activities we're doing, when they get into muscle memory, this part of the brain's taken over. So that's your anatomy of learning. All these theoretical concepts that we've talked about, especially learning style, that's where it's happening in the brain. Information processing, that big picture theory that's going to connect first half of the semester to the second half. We talked about where short-term memory was. We talked about where long-term memory was. We talked about where implicit was happening, where explicit was happening in the brain. That gives you the big picture items. Here are some references on information processing. Here is a reference on anatomy of the brain that you can go in and look at the lobes of the brain and what's happening and get more information. So this ends the first half. We'll get into some major projects, and then in week 9, we'll begin with implicit learning, but not just procedural. We'll go in depth into the affective domain of Bloom's taxonomy, the role of implicit learning as it relates to behavior, motivation, and the impact those have on learning.